26 floors above the city. A boardroom full of millionaires. One click, and everything he'd built over 30 years was about to explode in front of everyone who trusted him. She stood at the back of the room, hands steady, finger hovering over the trackpad. The file was ready. The projector was waiting. In 3 seconds, the screen would light up. And in 5 seconds, a man who preached integrity on stages around the world would watch his entire empire crumble because his secretary opened the wrong file. Or did she? This is the story you clicked for. A millionaire secretary who accidentally leaked his tax returns during the most important board meeting of his life. Except here's the thing. When you hear how she found those files, how long she waited, and what was actually hidden in them, you're going to wonder if anything about this was really an accident at all. Welcome to Money Stories That Matter. And if you're new here, hit subscribe right now, because stories like this don't end the way you think they will. The boardroom was designed to intimidate. 26 floors above the city, floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped the room like a crown, offering a panoramic view that reminded everyone seated at the table exactly where power lived. The table itself was long, polished, and reflective enough to mirror the confidence of the man at its head. Richard Halverson had chosen this room deliberately. He always did. At 52, he had mastered the art of appearances. The tailored navy suit, the restrained smile, the posture of a man who didn't rush because the world waited for him. Investors admired him. Junior executives feared him. The board trusted him completely.
Richard had built his reputation not only on numbers, but on narrative. He was the disciplined one, the transparent one, the man who preached fiscal responsibility in interviews, who lectured young entrepreneurs about clean books and ethical growth, who often said that real wealth wasn't about how much you made, but how responsibly you reported it. His TED Talk on corporate ethics had been viewed over 2 million times. His opinion pieces in the Wall Street Journal were treated like gospel. He was the face of modern capitalism done right. That morning, he planned to reinforce that image one more time, standing before the very people who had invested millions into his vision, his promises, his carefully constructed persona. Seated slightly behind him, near the far end of the table, was Claire Bennett, his executive secretary of 7 years. To most people in that room, she was invisible, a logistical extension of Richard himself, the one who scheduled meetings, prepared documents, muted microphones, and ensured that everything ran seamlessly. Claire knew his calendar better than his wife did. She knew which board members required printed packets instead of tablets, which investors liked their coffee black, and which questions Richard preferred to answer himself versus deflect. She was efficient, professional, and utterly reliable. Richard often joked that Claire was the only person in the building who truly knew how everything worked. He had no idea how true that statement was. What no one in that room understood was that Claire also knew something else. Something she had never been meant to see, and something she had never spoken aloud. A secret that had been eating away at her for months, growing heavier with every board meeting, every speech about integrity, every moment Richard stood before cameras and preached values he didn't actually live by.
The meeting opened as expected. Quarterly projections scrolled across the screen. Strategic restructuring plans were outlined with military precision. There was a brief applause when Richard announced cost optimizations that would protect shareholder value. He spoke calmly, confidently, as if every word had been rehearsed long before it left his mouth. And perhaps it had been. Richard believed in preparation. He believed in control. He believed that if you controlled the narrative, you controlled reality itself. Then came the agenda item he had been waiting for, a segment on regulatory compliance and tax efficiency. Richard leaned forward slightly, hands folded on the gleaming table, and launched into his familiar sermon. He spoke about integrity, about accountability, about how his company would always stay well within the lines, unlike competitors who played dangerous games with offshore structures and creative accounting. He referenced recent scandals involving other CEOs, shaking his head with practiced disappointment. Several board members nodded in agreement. One smiled approvingly. This was the Richard they admired, the moral compass of modern capitalism, the man who did things the right way. Claire stood when prompted, moving toward the screen at the front of the room to pull up the supporting documents. Her hands were steady, her expression neutral. She had performed this motion hundreds of times before. The routine was muscle memory by now. Connect the laptop, wait for the screen to sync, open the designated folder, click the file. Simple, automatic. Except nothing about this moment was simple anymore.
The file was labeled clearly, exactly as Richard had requested the night before. Tax Efficiency Overview Q4. Yet buried within that same folder, saved under a near-identical name, was another document, one Richard had never intended to be seen, one Claire had discovered months earlier while organizing archived financial records at his direct instruction. At the time, she had frozen. She remembered the moment vividly. Late evening, the office nearly empty, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead as she opened a file, expecting expense summaries, and instead found years of personal tax returns. Returns that told a very different story than the one Richard sold so confidently to the world. Claire had not gone looking for them. They had been there, mislabeled, carelessly stored, a digital footprint of decisions made when Richard assumed no one would ever check behind him. The numbers didn't just raise questions, they contradicted his entire public identity. Shell companies registered in tax havens, aggressive deductions that pushed every legal boundary, income streams routed through jurisdictions Richard openly criticized in interviews, year after year of carefully engineered minimization that bordered on deception, possibly crossed into it. Claire remembered staring at the screen, feeling her stomach tighten, realizing that the man who had once lectured her sternly about honesty during a minor expense discrepancy had built an empire on selective truth. Now, months later, as she connected her laptop to the projector, the weight of that knowledge pressed against her chest like a physical force. The cursor hovered on the screen. The room fell quiet, waiting. Richard continued speaking, unaware, describing his commitment to transparency with almost theatrical sincerity. His voice carried that tone of absolute conviction that had made him so successful, so trusted, so utterly believable. Claire's finger moved to the trackpad. She clicked.
For half a second, nothing seemed wrong. The projection screen flickered as it always did during transitions. Then the screen refreshed. A spreadsheet appeared, but not the one Richard expected, not the one anyone expected. The header read clearly, too clearly. Personal tax filings, consolidated summary, Richard Halverson. The room changed instantly. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out through the windows. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Someone shifted in their chair, the leather creaking loudly in the sudden silence. Another leaned forward, squinting at the screen, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Columns of figures filled the display. Declared income, offshore allocations, deductions that dwarfed reported revenue. Complex structures with names that sounded more like spy operations than legitimate business entities. The numbers told a story, and it wasn't the story Richard had been telling for the past decade. Silence thickened in the room, not with confusion, but with recognition. These weren't operational numbers. These were personal, exposed, raw. This was the man behind the curtain, and the curtain had just been ripped away in front of everyone who mattered most. Board members, major investors, the CFO, the general counsel, people who had bet their reputations on Richard's integrity. Richard's voice faltered mid-sentence. He turned toward the screen, then back toward Claire, his expression moving through disbelief, then calculation, then something colder and more primal. Fear, real fear, the kind that comes when years of careful construction collapse in an instant. His mouth opened, but no sound came out.
For a man who had always had the perfect words, the sudden silence was devastating.
Claire didn't move. She stood there, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the laptop, as if willing the moment to end, willing reality to rewind just 30 seconds so she could click the other file, the right file, the safe file. But time doesn't work that way. What's seen cannot be unseen. What's revealed cannot be hidden again. Now, before we continue, I want to hear from you. What would you do in Claire's position? If you accidentally discovered your boss was living a lie, would you stay silent or find a way to expose the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this ethical dilemma is more common than you think, and I want to know where you stand. And if you're finding this story as gripping as I am telling it, smash that like button so more people can discover money stories that matter. A board member cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Another asked quietly, carefully, "Richard, what is this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. It wasn't really asking for information. It was asking for an explanation, for reassurance, for Richard to make this make sense in a way that wouldn't destroy everything they had built together. The seconds stretched unbearably. Richard tried to speak, to laugh it off, to frame it as a misunderstanding or a mistake or outdated information. His media training kicked in automatically, deflect, reframe, control the narrative. But the data on the screen was unforgiving. Percentages didn't lie. Patterns didn't vanish just because they were inconvenient. What had taken years to hide now sat illuminated in high definition before the very people who had trusted him most. Every offshore account, every creative deduction, every structure designed to minimize what Richard publicly claimed he was proud to pay. His entire financial strategy was laid bare.
Claire finally spoke, her voice calm but unsteady, explaining that she had opened the file she believed was queued, that it had been saved in the same directory with an almost identical name, that she was deeply and sincerely sorry for the confusion. Her words sounded procedural, rehearsed, professional. But inside, her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was not vengeance, she told herself. It was not strategy. It was an accident. A terrible, career-ending, life-altering accident that only existed because the truth had been stored so carelessly. Richard had been sloppy, and now they were all paying the price. But was it really an accident? That's the question everyone would ask later. That's the question that would fuel speculation for months. Because here's what makes this story so fascinating. Claire had known about those files for months. She had seen them, been shocked by them, and then carefully, quietly, done nothing. She hadn't reported them, she hadn't confronted Richard, she hadn't even moved them to a different folder where they might be safer, more hidden. She had left them exactly where they were, in a directory she accessed regularly, filed under a name that was dangerously similar to legitimate business documents. Some might call that negligence, others might call it something else entirely. The meeting was adjourned within minutes. No applause, no closing remarks, no polite conversation about lunch plans or golf games, just the quiet scrape of chairs against marble floors, the avoidance of eye contact, the unspoken understanding that something irreversible had just occurred. The general counsel was already on his phone before he reached the door. The CFO looked pale, calculating the implications faster than anyone else in the room. An investor who had publicly defended Richard just last month stared at his hands, already composing the statement he would need to release.
Richard remained seated long after the room emptied, staring at the blank screen where his carefully constructed image had shattered. The projector had automatically gone dark, showing only a blue screen with the words, "No signal," which felt almost poetic. No signal, no message, no story left to tell. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if the exposure had physically drained something essential from him. For years he had been larger than life. Now he was just a man who had been caught. Claire packed her laptop slowly, methodically, aware that her life, like his, had just shifted onto a path she could not predict. She didn't know if she would be fired, sued, blamed, praised, vilified, called a whistleblower or a traitor, or simply incompetent. But she did know one thing with absolute certainty. The image Richard had spent decades constructing had cracked in a single click. And cracks like that don't heal. They only spread. What followed would ripple far beyond that boardroom. Investigations were launched within days. The SEC opened an inquiry. The IRS, already overwhelmed, suddenly found resources to take a very close look at Richard Halverson's returns going back 15 years. Journalists who had once written puff pieces about his leadership now competed to break the next damaging detail. Allies became distant. Partners reconsidered contracts. The board initiated an emergency review. Whispers spread through the industry like wildfire, carried by assistants and junior executives who had always suspected something wasn't quite right, but had never been able to prove it.
And at the center of it all stood a question no one could quite answer aloud. Was the leak truly an accident, or was it the inevitable moment when truth finally found the light, no matter how carefully it had been hidden? Had Claire's hand slipped on the trackpad, clicking the wrong file in a moment of simple human error? Or had some part of her, the part that had been silently carrying the weight of Richard's hypocrisy for months, guided that cursor with unconscious intention? Had she sabotaged him deliberately, or had the universe simply corrected an imbalance that couldn't be sustained any longer? Claire would maintain for the rest of her career that it was an accident, a simple, devastating mistake. She would tell investigators, lawyers, and eventually a journalist writing a book about corporate scandals that she had no motive to harm Richard, that she had always been professional, that the files should never have been stored where they were. And technically, she was right. The fault was Richard's. He had been careless with his secrets, storing them in plain sight, assuming his authority would protect him from scrutiny. Claire had simply opened a file. The rest was consequence. But here's what makes this story one for money stories that matter. Regardless of intent, the outcome was the same. Richard Halverson, the man who had built an empire on the narrative of ethical capitalism, was exposed as someone who preached values he didn't practice. The gap between his public persona and private reality was so vast that no amount of PR could bridge it. Within 6 months, he had resigned from 3 boards. Within a year, his company had been restructured, his name removed from the building, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of hypocrisy in the digital age. Claire, meanwhile, disappeared from public view. Some reports said she received a settlement. Others claimed she was blacklisted in the industry, unable to find work because no executive would trust her after what happened. A few conspiracy theorists insisted she had been hired by a competitor to bring Richard down from the inside, though no evidence ever emerged to support that theory. The truth was probably simpler and more human. She had been a woman in an impossible position, holding information that contradicted everything her boss represented. And whether through accident or unconscious choice, that information found its way into the light. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's about the danger of building your reputation on values you don't actually embody. Maybe it's about the risk of storing secrets in places where loyal employees might find them. Maybe it's about the fact that in the modern world, nothing stays hidden forever, especially when it's saved in a digital folder with a carelessly similar name to legitimate files. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Maybe it's just that the truth has a way of emerging, regardless of how many floors above the city you conduct your business, regardless of how carefully you craft your narrative, regardless of how much trust you've accumulated. Richard Halverson learned that lesson the hard way, in a boardroom designed to intimidate, before an audience he had spent years impressing. And it all came down to a single click.
made by a secretary who knew too much, in a moment that would be debated and analyzed for years to come. Was it an accident? Was it justice? Was it karma? The answer probably depends on who you ask and what you believe about the nature of truth, loyalty, and power.
What do you think? Was Claire right to stay silent for so long? Or should she have spoken up the moment she found those files? And in that final moment, do you believe her fingers slipped? Or do you think some part of her knew exactly what she was doing? I want to hear your theories in the comments below, because this story has layers that we could debate for hours. And if you want more stories like this, stories about wealth, power, and the moments when everything falls apart, you absolutely need to subscribe to Money Stories That Matter. We bring you the most compelling financial scandals and ethical dilemmas every week. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. This has been the story of how a millionaire's secretary accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, leaked his tax returns during a board meeting, destroying a carefully constructed image in seconds and proving once again that in the world of money and power, the most dangerous person in the room is often the one nobody's paying attention to. Thanks for watching Money Stories That Matter, and I'll see you in the next one.